A test automation strategy is most effective when everyone on your team understands, understands what is going on, because they're going to be the one that is going to implement it. So you want to have a strategy that allows your team to understand it so that you can get the return on investment. You want faster time to market, more reliable, faster test. However, in order to do that, it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and you don't just want to dive into it without first having an automation strategy. So your strategy is going to define how you're going to go about it. Who is going to be writing it? What are you going to be automating? Why are you doing automation in the first place? When do you automate? At what levels do you automate? What environments? And so we're going to break that down: the how, the why, the who, the what, and the when. The first thing that you want to do when creating a test automation strategy is identify the why. Why do you want to have automated tests? Have you sat and thought about that? What is the goal that you're trying to achieve by saying we're going to move from doing exploratory testing, manual testing, these types of testing, to now have some automated testing working alongside that? There are several goals that you may have. You may want to have a faster time to market. You may want to have automation ready at the same time that features are being built. So you maybe want to have automation in the same sprint as the features that you're being developing, as the features that are being developed. You may want to not have as much manual testing for your regression suite. Your regression suite may be taking a really long time to execute. And by introducing automation, you may be able to reduce that time. I have seen some persons have large regression suites that they have to spend days with multiple people going through. And so by having automation, that has allowed them to spend a little less time or a lot less time running those manually, and they can instead focus on different edge cases that may exist. You may also want to have more coverage. And so by using automation and data-driven testing to generate different user scenarios and unique scenarios, it may be easier with automation. You may also be transitioning from a waterfall to an agile approach, and you want to introduce continuous testing, continuous integration. That, along with other reasons, can be why you have test automation. The next thing after you have your goal is to think about who. And the who is very important. So you have defined your goal. You want to have test automation because you're transitioning from agile. You're transitioning to agile and you want it in a CI/CD pipeline. That may be your goal. Your goal may be that you want to have test automation running alongside the development tickets, right? Whatever your goal is, who is going to execute that goal? You'll need to have a team that can write tests, execute them, check for failures when they happen, update the scripts, create reports so that you can see if you're getting the value, maintain them, write regression tests, etc. It's a whole project and it's a whole lot of work. So you're going to need a team, and I recommend a dedicated team that is going to be looking at what you're doing and understand it and be able to execute that. Normally, persons, when they're trying to decide who is going to be on their team, they immediately default to the strongest technical person. That doesn't always have to be the case. I think that there should be a proper mix between junior and senior persons. Now, the senior members of your team, they're going to be more experienced in the language that you select and the framework that you select, so that they can create test automation frameworks independently. But you also want your junior members of the team to be able to learn from that person. So if you have a senior-junior relationship, there's always going to be somebody on your project that is able to maintain it and create new tests. And this is going to help the junior members of your team learn at a faster rate because they're on a project where they're learning test automation from someone with experience. Now, sometimes you may not have anyone in your organization. You may have to look and see that you need to hire. If that's the case, you will have to think about what will that job description say? What am I looking for this person or persons to have? If you don't want to hire, and let's say you already have a good sized team, you have persons on your team, but they are maybe exploratory testers, manual testers, they haven't written test automation before. That's where training can come in. And so I do training for a lot of different teams that want to learn how to do test automation. So you can train your team as well, but training takes time and it's something that you have to plan out and think about. You have to think about, do they have a programming language? Do they already know how to find locators? Have they ever used a test automation framework? If they haven't, then you have to create that curriculum to guide them to a point where they are able to do that. So thinking about who is going to be on your project is a big question because you want to ensure that you have the right match, you have the right team, and you want to give that team enough time to do what the goal is, to achieve the goal. You don't want to have your team still having to do their day-to-day work and then you tack on an automation project on top of that. That's going to be intensive and you don't want people to be burnt out. So consider automation as a project in itself that needs to be given that time and a dedicated team with the right people that you may have to hire or you may have to train to get them to where you want them to be. The next question when creating a test automation strategy is what? So you have the goal, you have who is going to be writing it, but what are you going to automate? Now, deciding what to automate allows you to zone in on the key areas that are going to give you the best return on investment. You don't want to dive in straight without a plan, and you need to know at what level you're going to automate. So you can either just automate unit tests. So unit tests are going to validate small components and functionalities. This is typically done by developers. So you may just decide that I don't want to hire persons to do UI right now. We're going to start by automating our unit tests if we haven't been doing so already. Then you may want to you may have a lot of APIs. And so having API testing is probably going to be important for you. So you want to do the service layer. You want somebody that can automate your APIs, automate your database, and verify how this works. Then you may be heavily driven in the user interface. Now, you can have persons that do UI automation. So you have to decide for your project, for your situation, what level is important, and also know that certain levels run faster than others. Certain levels are less prone to failure than others. So you have to consider all those factors. Outside of the level, I generally have a rule of thumb in terms of things that I am going to be automating. I consider the goal and I ensure that the goal is aligning with that. So if my goal was to reduce the amount of regression tests that we have to do manually, then I'm going to be automating regression tests. So if that is one of your goals, then you may want to prioritize that, right? Some things that you may want to automate are smoke tests. So smoke tests ensure that the most important aspects, the most basic components of an application are functioning correctly. They test areas that always need to work. So by automating your smoke tests, you can detect show-stopping bugs early, such as if your app or web page isn't loading, if your user isn't able to log in, if payment services are down, things like that. Having automated smoke tests can help you catch. Regression tests, if you have those, it's going to allow you to have a set of stable tests because based on regression, these are things that are already out there and should be working. So having those set of stable tests that you know, these are the critical functions of the application. These are existing functionalities that have been testing multiple times. And so if it fails, then you can start to debug that. I also like to automate exhaustive tests, and exhaustive tests talks about those with large sets of data, such as forms, if you're required to do the same workflow multiple times, but with a wide variety of data, you can create data-driven automation that is going to allow you to save some time. Now, data-driven automation is very beneficial as it allows you to not only modify the data, but as it allows you to modify the data of the script and get different results. And it's very reusable, it's very efficient. I also like to test things that have multiple configurations. So you can use Lambda tests to generate different operating system, different browsers. You can incorporate that into your test automation and give you a different combination of OS devices, screen sizes, all of that, because you want to ensure that when persons are using your applications, it doesn't just work on what you, the tester, have. It works on what the actual customers are going to be using. And then you also want to do performance tests. So you want to avoid launch failures, bad user experiences, things that are taking too long to load, things that don't work properly. You check the speed, you check the response time, you check the reliability and the scalability. Let's say you're having a big launch. For example, maybe you're having a Black Friday sale or a Cyber Monday sale, and you're expecting a lot of customers to come. How do you test for that? And how do you ensure that the store won't go down at that time? So this list of things is not exhaustive by any means. There are lots of other things that you can automate, but this is a great starting point to decide and to consider, am I going to include these things into my automation strategy? Are these possible things that I may want to automate? So be strategic and focused and sit with your current team, see what they're currently having issues with, see what bottlenecks are currently there, and see how you can use automation to solve that. The next question you want to ask is how. So how are you going to go about running your automated tests? You'll need to find a specific tool. You'll need to find a specific framework that fits your project needs. In deciding what tool to use, you first need to consider at what level you're going to be doing. So if you're doing API automation or database or visual regression, there are different tools, there are different technologies that can be used for each. So for API automation, you may use Postman, you may use Supertest if you're using JavaScript, you may use Rest Assured if you're using Java. So there's a wide range of tools to be considered based on what exactly you're going to be testing. The language that you're going to be using is very important as well. So you have Selenium WebDriver that can be used in many different languages. You can use it in Java, Python, JavaScript, Ruby, etc. And Selenium allows you to pair with Appium. That is if you want to do mobile automation. But in addition to Selenium WebDriver, there are other tools in the JavaScript ecosystem. There's WebDriver IO, Cypress, Playwright, etc. So there are a lot of different tools that you have to consider, different programming languages. You can decide that maybe you want to use the same programming language that your developers are using, especially if you want them to be a part of the test automation process and you kind of want a whole team approach. So you can decide to do that. You can also consider the language that the members of your team knows. So if more persons know JavaScript and are maybe familiar with a particular framework, you may lean that way. So there are lots of different things that you have to consider that will help you decide, am I going to be using this language, this framework, this tool? You also want to think about the scenarios that you want to test. Are there any unique scenarios? Are there any edge case scenarios? And the tool that you're going to be selecting, does it solve for these unique scenarios? You don't want to have a tool that the more important scenarios it's not going to do, you're going to have to use a next tool on it. So think about it. For example, if cross-browser testing is important to you, you may want to use Lambda test in your automation strategy. You also then have to consider, what was my goal in the first place? And this is something that should always be on your mind when creating your automation strategy. What is my goal? If you had continuous integration as a goal, you will then need to start look at continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines and tools that can offer you that service. And then the cost of the tool. A lot of companies do have budgets. There are tools that are free to the community, but there are also tools that are paid for. So think about how much are you willing to spend, if any, to get what you want done. So once you have those things, I normally like to create a table with all the features that I want to automate, as well as must-haves for different tools. And then I have a list of my more important things. And I'm writing out a list of top 6 tools. And then I'm adding a check mark to the tools that meet a certain criteria that I'm looking for. Once I have that, I then select my top 2 and I do a proof of concept with my edge cases to see, is it going to satisfy not only the everyday tests, but these edge cases that are really important to me. So this stage is going to take a lot of time, is going to take a lot of research, but you have to take the time to carefully evaluate the tool, because you're going to have that tool for a long while. I've been in companies where they are quote unquote stuck with a tool because management have already paid a certain amount of money for it. So it's now at a point where we have to use this tool because we already have a subscription for 5 years, or already have a subscription for this number of time, even though that tool is not the best tool or framework for the job. So you don't want to be in a situation of regret. So take the time to think about what tool you're going to use and why you're going to be using that tool. The next thing is where and when. So this is kind of the final thing that you want to consider for a solid test automation strategy. You've talked about the goal, you've talked about who, you've talked about what, you've talked about how, but where and when. So I think a lot of us should have a dedicated test environment. If not, then I would suggest that your automation runs in a dedicated test environment. The reason for this is because it allows you to manipulate the data so that you can get different scenarios for testing. So if you want a suspended user, if you want a newly created user, if you want a user with things already in their cart, you want a user with a blocked credit card, whatever the scenarios are in your test environment, it's your safe space to kind of play with that data and create those different scenarios. Once you do that, think about the work that may be involved in creating this dedicated environment if you don't have one, and include that in your automated strategy or plan to get it implemented. Now, with the dedicated test environment, I'm not saying that you aren't going to be running your test on production. I think you should, and I also suggest that you run your test on production. However, first, you can run them on your test environment where you have certain users. The tests that you're going to be running on production, they should be tagged so that only specific tests are run. You don't want to have delete queries or delete users and somebody in the real world no longer have an account or no longer have a purchase history because you ran a test and deleted their information. So be very careful with production automated tests. Tag them correctly to ensure that only what should be run in production is actually run. So have an execution plan for your test. I have a list of questions that I typically answer at this stage. And these questions are, do you need to set up specific data for your test? Do you need to make database connections or API calls? How does the data that you have in your test need to be masked? How do you set up your test? How do you tear down your test after so that it doesn't impact other tests that may come later on? Are you going to be running these tests locally on your computer? Are you going to be using a continuous integration system? Are there specific times that you want your test to run? Is there a trigger for when your automated test is going to be executed? What repositories are you going to be using to store code? Do you have a process for merging and for pull request approvals? And how are you going to be reporting your automated test run? It's a lot of detail to consider. It's going to take time. So ensure that you consider all of these details, right? So those are the questions that you are going to ask.